I never thought the people I'd given my entire life to would celebrate my 70th birthday by throwing me out like garbage. Not my 3 children, Marcus, Elena, and David, whom I'd raised as a widowed father after their mother died when they were just 8, 10, and 12 years old. Not the kids I'd worked double shifts at the steel mill for, skipping meals so they could have new school clothes. Not the young adults whose college tuitions I'd paid by taking out a second mortgage on the house their grandfather built with his own hands. Not the successful professionals who used to call me their hero, their rock, their everything. But there I was, standing on the porch of the home I'd lived in for 45 years, watching my own children change the locks while I was inside blowing out birthday candles, believing we were celebrating another year of life together. What they didn't know was that their old man had one card left to play, something they'd completely forgotten about in their rush to claim what they thought was rightfully theirs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other birthday in the Morrison household. I woke up in the master bedroom where Margaret and I had shared 32 years of marriage before cancer took her away 18 years ago. The walls still held our wedding. Photos, family portraits from when the kids were small, and the hand-painted mural Margaret had insisted on. A sunrise over the mountains that reminded her of our honeymoon in Colorado. At 70, my body creaked more than it used to, but my mind was sharp as ever. I'd been looking forward to this day for weeks, not because I particularly enjoyed getting older, but because it meant having all 3 kids under one roof again. Marcus, my eldest at 42, had driven up from Phoenix where he ran a successful accounting firm. He'd always been the serious one, methodical and calculating like his mother, but with a warmth that made him the family mediator growing up. Elena, 39, flew in from Seattle where she worked as a real estate developer. She'd inherited my stubborn streak and Margaret's artistic eye, turning abandoned buildings into beautiful living spaces. And David, my baby at 37, had taken the train from Chicago where he taught high school mathematics. He was the dreamer of the family, always talking about changing the world through education, just like his mother had. The house buzzed with activity as they prepared for what they'd told me would be a small family gathering. Elena was in the kitchen, preparing my favorite meal. Margaret's secret recipe for beef bourguignon that she'd finally mastered after years of trying. Marcus was setting up the dining room, arranging flowers and candles with the same precision he brought to financial statements. David was in the living room, setting up the old record player and sorting through my collection of jazz albums, looking for the songs Margaret and I used to dance to. "Dad, you just relax," Elena called from the kitchen, her voice carrying that gentle authority she'd developed in her business dealings. "This is your day. We're handling everything." I settled into my favorite armchair, the worn leather recliner I'd bought when David started kindergarten. From there, I could see into the kitchen where Elena worked, humming softly like her mother used to do. The afternoon sun streamed through the bay windows, casting golden patterns on the hardwood floors I'd refinished myself 5 years ago when arthritis hadn't yet made such projects impossible. Marcus emerged from the dining room, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Dad, Elena and I were talking earlier about the house," he said, settling onto the couch across from me. "We know maintaining this place is getting harder for you." I looked around the spacious living room with its high ceilings and original crown molding. The house was indeed large for one person. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a formal dining room, and a basement workshop where I'd taught all 3 kids how to use tools properly. But it was home. Every creaking floorboard told a story. Every scuff mark on the walls marked a memory. "I managed just fine," I said, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. The gutters needed cleaning, the front steps were starting to sag, and the furnace made concerning noises during the winter months. But I'd lived in this house for 45 years. Margaret and I had bought it from her father when we got married, and her father had built it himself in 1952. 3 generations of family history lived within these walls. David looked up from the record collection. We're not saying you can't handle it, Dad. We're just thinking about what might be easier for you. There are some really nice senior communities around here now, places where you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance, where there are activities and people your age. I felt a familiar defensiveness rising in my chest. At 70, I was hardly decrepit. I still drove my truck to the hardware store every Saturday. I still maintained my small garden out back, growing the tomatoes and peppers Margaret had loved. I still met my buddy Frank for coffee and Domino's every Tuesday at the diner downtown. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully, but I'm not ready for a retirement home. This house is where I want to be. Elena appeared in the doorway, flour dusting her apron. We're not talking about a retirement home, Dad. We're talking about a nice apartment or condo. Somewhere with no yard work, no furnace maintenance, no worrying about property taxes going up every year. The mention of property taxes stung because it was true. The neighborhood had been discovered by young professionals over the past decade, and the tax assessments had skyrocketed accordingly. What had once been a working-class area was now dotted with renovated craftsman homes selling for prices that would have been unimaginable when Margaret and I first moved in. The taxes are manageable, I said, though my pension and Social Security were increasingly stretched to cover them along with utilities, insurance, and basic maintenance. Marcus leaned forward, his accountant instincts taking over. Dad, Elena and I ran some numbers. Between property taxes, utilities, insurance, and regular maintenance, this house costs you almost $1,800 a month just to keep. That's more than half your income. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I knew he was right, but the numbers didn't capture what this house meant to me. This was where Margaret and I had brought each of our babies home from the hospital. This was where we'd hosted birthday parties and Christmas mornings, where I'd taught David to ride a bike in the long hallway when it was too cold to go outside. This was where Margaret had spent her final months. In the sunroom we'd converted into a bedroom when the stairs became too difficult for her. Money isn't everything, I said quietly. Of course not, Elena said, coming to sit on the arm of my chair, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. But we worry about you here alone. What if something happens? What if you fall or have a medical emergency? Their concern was touching, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation had been planned in advance. The 3 of them had clearly discussed this before arriving, probably over phone calls and emails in the weeks leading up to my birthday. I was being presented with what they saw as a logical solution to a problem I wasn't sure existed. I have my medical alert bracelet, I reminded them. And Mrs. Chen next door checks on me every day. Mrs. Chen was 83 and barely 5 feet tall, but she was sharper than any of my children and tougher than most men half her age. She'd been widowed around the same time as me, and we'd developed an unspoken partnership over the years. She brought me soup when I was sick, and I helped her with things that required more height or strength than she possessed. Mrs. Chen is wonderful, David said diplomatically, but she's not exactly equipped to handle a real emergency. The conversation continued through the afternoon as we moved toward dinner. My children presented their case with the same thoroughness they brought to their professional lives. They'd researched apartment complexes, calculated cost savings, and even identified specific units that would be available within the next few months. They spoke about independence and quality of life, about the peace of mind they'd have knowing I was safe and cared for. But underneath their practical arguments, I sensed something else. Elena kept glancing around the house with the appraising eye she'd developed in real estate development. Marcus asked detailed questions about the property boundaries and recent, comparable sales in the neighborhood. David seemed particularly interested in the basement workshop and its collection of vintage tools. As Elena called us to dinner, I pushed these suspicions aside. These were my children, the people I'd sacrificed everything for. If they were encouraging me to downsize, it was because they loved me and wanted what was best for me. I'd raised them to be thoughtful, caring adults, and that's exactly what they were being. The dining room looked magnificent in the candlelight. Elena had outdone herself with dinner. The beef bourguignon was perfect, accompanied by roasted vegetables from my garden and a bottle of wine Marcus had brought from Phoenix. We shared stories and memories, laughing about childhood mishaps and family vacations. For a few hours, it felt like the old days when they were young, and the house was always full of their friends and activities. After dinner, they presented me with gifts. Marcus gave me a tablet computer, patiently explaining how I could use it to video chat with them and their families. Elena had commissioned a photo album documenting our family history, with pictures I hadn't seen in years and captions written in her careful handwriting. David's gift was the most personal, a wooden box he'd made himself, inlaid with different woods in a pattern that matched the sunrise mural in the master bedroom. "For your important papers," he explained. "Mom always said you needed better organization for documents." As the evening wound down, Elena brought out a birthday cake, chocolate with vanilla frosting, my favorite since childhood. 70 candles. Seemed like an enormous number, but I managed to blow them all out in 2 breaths while my children cheered and took pictures with their phones. "Make a wish, Dad," David said, his arm around my shoulders. I closed my eyes and wished for more evenings like this one, with all my children happy and healthy and gathered around the table where we'd shared so many meals over the years. After cake, Marcus suggested we move to the living room for coffee. As Elena cleared the dishes and David put on some music, Marcus pulled out a manila folder he'd left on the side table earlier. "Dad, there's one more thing we wanted to discuss with you tonight," he said, his tone shifting to the professional demeanor I'd seen him use during his rare visits when he needed to handle some aspect of his business. "What's that, son?" He opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "Elena found a perfect apartment for you. It's in that new senior living complex on Riverside Drive, the one with the beautiful gardens and the community center. We've arranged for you to see it tomorrow." I felt a chill despite the warmth of the evening. "I thought we'd settled this earlier. I'm not ready to move." Elena returned from the kitchen, her expression serious. "Dad, we've been thinking about this for months. We're all adults now with our own families and responsibilities. We can't keep worrying about you rattling around in this big house by yourself. I'm not asking you to worry about me." David sat down across from me, his teacher's patience evident in his voice. "It's not about what you're asking, Dad. It's about what's realistic. This house is too much for one person. The neighborhood is changing. Your friends are all in assisted living now, except for Mrs. Chen, and she's not going to be able to help you much longer either." I looked around at my children, successful, confident adults who spoke about my life as if it were a problem, requiring their intervention. "This is my home," I said firmly. "It's where your mother and I built our life together. It's where you all grew up. I'm not leaving it because you think I should." Marcus exchanged glances with his siblings before continuing. "Dad, we've already put a deposit down on the apartment. The lease starts next month. We've arranged for a moving company to help pack your things, and Elena knows people who can handle selling the house." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You did what?" "We knew you'd resist if we asked first," Elena said, her real estate negotiation skills on full display. "But once you see the apartment and understand how much easier your life will be, you'll thank us." I stood up slowly, anger building in my chest like steam in a kettle. "You had no right to make decisions about my life without consulting me." "Dad, please sit down," David said, his voice taking on the gentle but firm tone he probably used with difficult students. "We're doing this because we love you. If you loved me, you'd respect my wishes about my own home." Marcus leaned forward, his financial instincts taking control of the conversation. "Dad, be practical about this. You're 70 years old. How much longer do you realistically think you can maintain this property? What happens when you can't drive anymore? What happens when you need help with daily activities? I'll handle those situations when they arise, I said. I don't need my children making those decisions for me now. Elena stood up, her developer's determination evident in her posture. Actually, Dad, we've thought about that too. We've prepared some paperwork that will make it easier for us to help you when you need it. Power of attorney documents, healthcare, directives, that sort of thing. She pulled more papers from Marcus's folder. We can sign these tonight while we're all together. It will save so much trouble later. I stared at the documents they'd prepared without my knowledge, the apartment they'd selected without my input, the future they'd planned without my consent. These were the children I'd raised to be independent thinkers, to stand up for what they believed in, to treat others with respect and dignity. Yet here they were, treating me like an incompetent old man whose opinions didn't matter. I'm not signing anything tonight, I said firmly, and I'm not moving to any apartment you've chosen for me. The room fell silent, except for the jazz music still playing softly in the background. Miles Davis's trumpet seemed to echo the tension that had suddenly filled the space where moments before we'd been celebrating my birthday. Marcus closed the folder and set it aside. Okay, Dad, we understand this is a lot to process. Why don't you sleep on it tonight? We can talk more in the morning. I nodded, exhausted by the conversation and confused by the sudden shift from birthday celebration to what felt like an intervention. I think that's a good idea. It's been a long day. We said our goodnights with less warmth than usual. Elena kissed my cheek and told me she loved me, but her eyes held a determination that made me uneasy. Marcus squeezed my shoulder and reminded me that everything they were suggesting was for my own good. David hugged me tightly and whispered that change was hard, but sometimes necessary. As I prepared for bed, I could hear them talking quietly in the kitchen, their voices too low for me to make out words, but urgent enough to confirm that their planning wasn't finished. I brushed my teeth and put on my pajamas, the same routine. I'd followed for decades, but nothing felt quite right anymore. I lay in bed staring at Margaret's side of the mattress, wishing she were there to help me understand how our children had become people who would make major life decisions for me without my consent. She'd always been better at reading people's motivations, at seeing through surface explanations to underlying truths. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of strangers packing my belongings and loading them into trucks while I stood helplessly watching. I woke several times to the sound of my children's voices drifting up from the kitchen, apparently engaged in late-night planning sessions for my future. Morning came earlier than usual, with sunlight streaming through the curtains Margaret had chosen 20 years ago. I could smell coffee brewing downstairs and hear movement in the kitchen. For a moment, it felt like any other morning when the kids had spent the night, bringing back memories of their teenage years when weekend mornings meant lazy brunches and family time. But as consciousness fully returned, I remembered the previous evening's conversation and felt the same knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. Today, apparently, we would continue discussing my relocation whether I wanted to or not. I dressed slowly, taking time to look around the bedroom that had been my sanctuary for so many years. Margaret's perfume bottles still sat on her dresser, though their contents had long since evaporated. Her jewelry box held the simple pieces she'd treasured: her wedding ring, which I'd moved there after her death, a pearl necklace that had been her mother's, and the watch I'd given her for our 10th anniversary. This room held 45 years of my life. This house held the only adulthood I'd ever known. The idea of leaving it felt like betraying not just my own memories, but Margaret's as well. I made my way downstairs, expecting to find my children, preparing breakfast, and perhaps ready to apologize for pushing too hard the night before. Instead, I found Marcus at the kitchen table with more paperwork spread in front of him, Elena on her phone apparently speaking with someone about contracts, and David loading boxes into his car. "Good morning, Dad," Elena said, ending her call. "Did you sleep well?" "Well enough. What's all this activity?" Marcus looked up from his papers with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. We decided to get an early start on the day. There's a lot to accomplish if we're going to get you moved smoothly. I told you last night that I haven't agreed to move anywhere. David came back inside, slightly out of breath from carrying boxes. Dad, we've been thinking about this all night. The apartment won't be available much longer, and the sooner we get this process started, the easier it will be for everyone. Elena moved to the counter where she'd apparently been making lists. I've scheduled the movers for next Friday. That gives us a week to sort through your things and decide what you'll want to keep in a smaller space. I felt the same anger from the night before, but now it was mixed with something else. A growing realization that my children had no intention of respecting my wishes. You scheduled movers without my permission. Dad, Marcus said in his reasonable accountant voice, we're trying to help you avoid the stress of making all these arrangements yourself. The stress of making my own decisions about my own life? Elena sighed with the patience of someone dealing with an unreasonable client. You're being emotional about this instead of practical. We've done the research, run the numbers, and found the perfect solution. All you have to do is trust us. Trust them. The irony was bitter in my mouth. These were the people I'd trusted, with my heart, my hopes, and my entire identity as a father. I'd worked myself to exhaustion to give them opportunities I'd never had. I'd sacrificed my own dreams so they could pursue theirs. And now they were asking me to trust them as they dismantled the life I'd built. What if I refuse? I asked quietly. The question hung in the air for a long moment. My children exchanged glances, and I saw something pass between them, some understanding they'd reached during their late-night planning session. Marcus cleared his throat. Dad, we've talked to a lawyer about this situation. Given your age, and the fact that you're living alone in a house that's becoming too much for you to handle, there are legal options available if you're not able to make sound decisions about your own welfare. The threat was delivered in Marcus's professional tone, but it was a threat nonetheless. They were prepared to have me declared incompetent if I didn't cooperate with their plans. I see, I said, though I was beginning to see much more than they realized. David looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. It wouldn't come to that, Dad. We're family. We just want what's best for you. And you've decided what's best for me is to leave my home and move somewhere. You've chosen signing papers that give you control over my affairs. It's not control, Elena protested. It's protection. Protection for you and peace of mind for us. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table where Margaret and I had shared breakfast every morning for 32 years. The surface was scarred from decades of use, homework sessions, craft projects, family meetings, and quiet conversations between husband and wife after the children were asleep. I need some time to think about all this, I said finally. Of course, Marcus said, gathering his papers. We'll give you some space this morning. But Dad, we really do need an answer today. There are deadlines involved, and the longer we wait, the more complicated everything becomes. They left me alone in the kitchen with my coffee and my thoughts. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Chen working in her garden, methodically tending to the tomato plants we'd discussed sharing this summer. Her husband had built raised beds for her before he died, and she maintained them with the same precision she brought to everything else in her life. As I watched her work, I found myself thinking about the basement workshop where I'd spent so many hours over the years. David had been particularly interested in it the night before, asking detailed questions about the tools and equipment I'd accumulated. Margaret used to joke that I had a museum's worth of vintage woodworking equipment down there, including some pieces that had belonged to her father. Something nagged at me about David's interest, just as something had bothered me about Elena's. Appraising looks around the house and Marcus's detailed questions about property values. I'd assumed their curiosity was natural, children inevitably wondering what they might inherit someday. But combined with their sudden insistence that I move immediately, their interest took on a different character. I finished my coffee and made a decision. If my children were planning my future without consulting me, perhaps it was time I did some planning of my own. The basement felt different as I descended the creaking wooden stairs that afternoon. For 45 years, this had been my sanctuary, the place where I retreated when life upstairs became overwhelming, where I'd taught my children the value of working with their hands, where I'd built cribs for each of them and later helped them with school projects that required more skill than kitchen table crafts could provide. The workshop stretched across the entire foundation of the house, lit by fluorescent fixtures I'd installed myself in the 1980s. Hand tools hung in precise arrangements on pegboard walls, their outlines traced in black marker so I'd know immediately if something was missing. Power tools occupied designated stations. The table saw Margaret had worried about for 30 years, the drill press that had helped me build the deck, the router table where I'd shaped trim pieces for the kitchen renovation. But it wasn't the tools that drew my attention now. It was the filing cabinet in the corner, the one David had asked about with such casual interest. Margaret had insisted I keep all important documents in one place, and over the decades, that four-drawer cabinet had become the repository for everything significant in our lives. Birth certificates, insurance policies, tax returns, warranties, and legal documents filled manila folders arranged in Margaret's meticulous system. I pulled out the bottom drawer and found what I was looking for, the thick folder labeled Property, Documents, in Margaret's careful handwriting. Inside were deeds, surveys, property tax records, and improvement permits dating back to 1952, when Margaret's father had first built this house. But buried near the back was a document I'd almost forgotten about, one that Margaret had insisted we create but I'd never expected to need. The mineral rights deed was signed in 1978, when a geological survey company had approached property owners in our neighborhood about potential natural gas deposits beneath their land. Most neighbors had dismissed it as a long shot, but Margaret's father had been a practical man who believed in covering all possibilities. He'd retained the mineral rights when he sold us the house, then transferred them to Margaret and me as a wedding gift, with the stipulation that they'd pass to our children only if we chose to include them in our will. Margaret and I had never mentioned the mineral rights to the kids. They'd seemed like an abstract concept, valuable only in theory, and we'd focused on more immediate concerns like college tuition and mortgage payments. But the document I held in my hands represented ownership of everything beneath our property, down to the center of the earth: oil, gas, minerals, and anything else that might be discovered there. I sat heavily on my workshop stool, the implications hitting me like a sledgehammer to the chest. 3 months ago, a development company had approached me about selling the house. They'd offered significantly more than current market value, which I'd found puzzling but not suspicious. I declined without much consideration, but now I wondered if their interest had less to do with the house itself and more to do with what lay beneath it. My hands shook slightly as I rifled through the property folder, looking for any other documents I might have forgotten. Near the bottom, I found a letter from the same geological survey company, dated 6 months ago. It was addressed to current property owner and mentioned updated surveys indicating promising subsurface conditions in our neighborhood. The letter requested permission to conduct more detailed analysis and hinted at potential significant value for mineral rights holders. I'd thrown the letter away without reading it carefully, assuming it was some kind of scam. But if my children had somehow learned about the mineral rights and the recent geological interest, it would explain their sudden urgency about moving me out of the house. It would explain Elena's appraising looks, Marcus's questions about property boundaries, and David's interest in the workshop where important documents were stored. The sound of footsteps on the basement stairs interrupted my thoughts. David appeared at the bottom, his expression friendly, but his eyes immediately scanning the workshop as if cataloging its contents. "Hey, Dad, I was wondering if you'd show me how that router table works. I've been thinking about getting into woodworking myself." I slipped the mineral rights deed under some other papers, keeping my voice casual. It's pretty straightforward once you understand the basics. Your grandfather was the one who really knew his way around tools, though. He built this whole workshop with hand tools and determination. David ran his hand along the router table's fence, his attention seeming to focus on the filing cabinet. Grandpa was amazing. I still remember him showing me how to measure twice and cut once. Speaking of measuring, do you have the original blueprints for the house? I'd love to see how he planned everything out. They're around somewhere, I said, deliberately vague. Why the sudden interest in construction documents? He shrugged, but I caught something forced in his casualness. Just curious about family history, I guess. It would be cool to understand how he built this place from the ground up. We spent the next hour discussing woodworking techniques, but I could feel David's attention wandering to the filing cabinet whenever he thought I wasn't looking. When Elena called down that lunch was ready, he lingered for a moment after I started toward the stairs. Dad, if you ever want help organizing all those old papers, I'd be happy to help. I know Mom was great at filing, but it might be time to digitize some of those documents. I'll keep that in mind, I said, but I'd already decided that no one was getting access to those files without my explicit permission. Lunch was a strained affair. My children maintained the pretense of casual family time, but undercurrents of tension ran through every conversation. Elena mentioned that she'd spoken with a real estate agent who could provide a market analysis of the house just for planning purposes. Marcus talked about the advantages of having family members with power of attorney when dealing with banks and insurance companies. David brought up the apartment complex again, emphasizing its proximity to medical facilities and public transportation. They were working in concert, I realized, each playing a role in a carefully orchestrated campaign to convince me that leaving my home was not just sensible but inevitable. They'd probably been planning this for months, dividing responsibilities, and developing strategies like a corporate takeover. After lunch, I excused myself for my daily walk, a routine I'd maintained for 20 years. The neighborhood had indeed changed dramatically over the past decade. Young families had moved into renovated houses, drawn by the area's proximity to downtown and its affordable prices compared to trendier districts. Property values had doubled, then tripled, as developers recognized the potential in these solid, well-built homes. But as I walked the familiar streets, I began noticing things I'd overlooked before. Survey markers appeared in several yards, and at least 3 houses displayed the discrete signs of geological testing companies. The development company that had approached me wasn't interested in just my property. They were systematically evaluating the entire neighborhood. I stopped at Frank's house, my weekly Domino's partner, and one of the few remaining original residents. Frank was 82, sharp as ever, and had lived on this street for 55 years. He was watering his front garden when I approached. His ancient retriever sleeping in the shade of a maple tree we'd both watched grow from a sapling. "Bill!" Frank called out. "How was the birthday celebration? I saw all your kids' cars in the driveway yesterday." "Interesting," I said carefully. "Frank, have you had anyone approach you recently about selling your house? Or any companies? Asking about mineral rights?" Frank turned off his hose and gave me his full attention. "Funny you should ask. Last month, some young fellow in an expensive suit came by asking if I'd be interested in selling. Offered me almost twice what I figured the place was worth." "Did you consider it?" "Hell no. Where would I go? This is my home, just like yours is yours." Frank paused, studying my expression. But he mentioned something about the whole neighborhood being part of some development project. Said they were trying to acquire multiple properties for optimal land use, whatever that means. "What about geological surveys? Anyone asking permission to test your property?" Frank's eyes sharpened. "You know, there was something like that. Got a letter a few months back from some survey company. Didn't pay it much attention, but they mentioned something about mineral rights and potential value beneath existing properties." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two old men trying to make sense of forces beyond our immediate understanding. Frank had been a machinist before retirement, practical and methodical in his thinking. If he was puzzled by recent events, I wasn't imagining the strangeness of the situation. "Frank, can I ask you something? If someone wanted to force you out of your house, what would be the easiest way to do it?" He considered the question seriously. "Well, if I was unscrupulous and had legal knowledge, I'd probably try to get power of attorney somehow. Maybe convince family members that I was incompetent or unable to care for myself. Then I could make decisions on the person's behalf, including selling property or moving them to assisted living." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. My children weren't just concerned about my welfare, they were positioning themselves to control my assets. The apartment, the power of attorney documents, the urgent timeline for moving. It was all designed to separate me from my property before I could discover its true value. I spent the rest of my walk thinking about Margaret and what she would have done in this situation. She'd always been the strategist in our marriage, the one who thought 3 moves ahead while I focused on immediate problems. She would have seen through my children's plan long before I did, and she would have developed a counter-strategy that protected both my interests and preserved family relationships if possible. By the time I returned home, I'd decided on my course of action. If my children wanted to play chess with my life, I needed to understand all the pieces on the board before making my next move. The house was quiet when I entered. Elena was on the front porch, speaking intensely into her phone about timeline acceleration and closing dates. Marcus was in the dining room with his laptop, apparently working on spreadsheets that involved my property address. David was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear movement in the basement. I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea, then sat at the table where I could observe the activity without seeming to pay attention. Elena's phone conversation involved someone named Jennifer, who was apparently coordinating with multiple property owners in the neighborhood. Marcus's spreadsheets included columns for acquisition costs, development potential, and projected returns. David emerged from the basement carrying a small stack of papers, which he handed to Marcus before noticing I was in the kitchen. "Just helping organize some of those old documents, Dad," he said with forced cheerfulness. "Some of the papers down there are pretty outdated." "Find anything interesting?" "Just old tax records and utility bills. Nothing important." But I noticed he avoided meeting my eyes, and Marcus quickly closed his laptop when David approached the dining room table. That evening, my children prepared dinner with the same efficiency they'd shown the night before, but the atmosphere was different. They moved with purpose now, like people working toward a deadline. Their conversation focused on practical matters, moving, timelines, storage solutions, and the logistics of transiting an elderly person to a new living situation. "Dad," Elena said as we finished eating, "we've been thinking about tomorrow's apartment viewing. Instead of just looking at one unit, we've arranged to see several options so you can choose the one that feels most comfortable." "That's very thoughtful," I said, though I had no intention of viewing any apartments. Marcus pulled out his ever-present folder of documents. "We've also streamlined those power of attorney papers. Our lawyer friend said the simplified version would be much easier for you to understand and wouldn't require multiple signatures." I looked at the papers he placed before me. They were indeed simpler than the previous version, but they also granted broader authority to my children over my financial and medical decisions. With my signature on these documents, they could sell my house, access my bank accounts, and make medical decisions on my behalf. "I'd like to have my own lawyer review these before signing anything," I said. David looked surprised. "Dad, why? Would you need a lawyer? We're your children. We're looking out for your best interests." "If it's truly in my best interest, then having legal counsel review the documents shouldn't be a problem." Elena's developer instincts kicked in. "These are standard forms, Dad. Having a lawyer review them would just cost money and delay the process unnecessarily." What's the rush? I asked. Yesterday you said I needed time to think about everything. Today you're pushing for immediate signatures on legal documents. Marcus exchanged glances with his siblings. We're not pushing, Dad. We're just trying to be efficient. The apartment won't be available indefinitely, and if we wait too long, you might lose this opportunity. I set down my fork and looked at each of my children in turn. What aren't you telling me? The question created an uncomfortable silence. Elena fidgeted with her napkin. Marcus closed the document folder. David stared at his plate. Finally, Elena spoke. Dad, we know this is difficult for you. Change is always hard, especially at your age. But sometimes adult children have to make difficult decisions for their parents' own good. Even when the parent disagrees with those decisions? Especially then, Marcus said firmly. Elderly people often can't see their own limitations clearly. They become attached to houses and routines that are no longer safe or practical. I felt something shift inside me, a combination of anger and clarity that reminded me of the determination I'd felt at Margaret's funeral, when I'd promised her I'd take care of our children no matter what it cost me. But now, those same children were treating me like an obstacle to be managed, rather than a person deserving respect and autonomy. I see, I said quietly. And if I refuse to cooperate with your plans? David looked uncomfortable, but Marcus answered without hesitation. Then we'll have to explore other options. Legal options that ensure you get the care and protection you need. The threat was clear now. They were prepared to have me declared incompetent if I didn't voluntarily surrender control of my life and property. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 70 years, but also feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades. The cold determination that had carried me through Margaret's illness, through years of working multiple jobs, through every crisis that had threatened my family's welfare. I think I'll sleep on all of this, I said calmly. It's a lot to process. Of course, Dad, Elena said, relief evident in her voice. Take all the time you need. But I could see in their expressions that they expected my answer to be yes, that they viewed my consideration as merely a formality before inevitable capitulation. They were wrong. After they'd gone to bed, I sat in my workshop surrounded by the tools and projects that had defined so much of my adult life. Margaret's jewelry box sat on my workbench, the one I'd made for our 10th anniversary. Inside were the mineral rights deed and several other documents I'd retrieved from the filing cabinet while my children were busy with their own planning. I thought about the house Margaret's father had built with his own hands, about the years Margaret and I had invested in making it our home, about the children I'd raised within these walls. This wasn't just about property or money. It was about the right to determine my own future and to protect the legacy Margaret and I had built together. My children had forgotten that their old man hadn't survived 70 years by being naive or helpless. They'd forgotten that I'd built a successful career, raised 3 children alone after Margaret's death, and managed my affairs competently for decades. Most importantly, they'd forgotten that the man who'd taught them to be strong and independent might have learned something about strategy and determination along the way. As I turned off the workshop lights and headed upstairs to bed, I was already planning my next moves. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring opportunities. My children thought they held all the cards, but they were about to discover that their old man had been playing a longer game than they realized. The mineral rights deed felt heavy in my pocket as I climbed the stairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Margaret for 32 years. Tomorrow, I would begin fighting for my home, my autonomy, and my dignity. But tonight, I would rest and remember that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with force, but with patience, wisdom, and the kind of quiet strength that comes from knowing exactly what you're fighting for. The next morning, I woke before dawn with the clarity that comes from making difficult decisions. While my children slept upstairs in their childhood bedrooms, I dressed quietly and slipped out of the house. The cool morning air carried the scent of Mrs. Chen's jasmine flowers and the distant sound of early commuters beginning their day. But instead of my usual walk around the neighborhood, I had a specific destination in mind. Downtown at 6:30 in the morning was a different world from the one most people knew. Coffee shops were opening, delivery trucks navigated narrow streets, and a handful of early risers walked purposefully toward office buildings. I parked my truck outside Hartwell and Associates, the law firm where Margaret and I had drawn up our wills 20 years ago. James Hartwell Jr. was the son of the original founder, and he'd taken over the practice when his father retired. More importantly, he was someone who'd known our family for decades and understood the values Margaret and I had tried to instill in our children. The receptionist looked surprised to see anyone at such an early hour, but she recognized me immediately. "Mr. Morrison, how wonderful to see you. Are you here for an appointment with James?" "Actually, I was hoping he might have a few minutes to speak with me this morning. It's somewhat urgent." She checked her computer screen. "He usually gets in around 7:15. Would you like to wait? I can start some coffee." I settled into the familiar waiting room where Margaret and I had sat nervous decades ago, planning for futures we couldn't imagine. The walls held the same landscape paintings, and the leather chairs showed the comfortable wear of a practice that valued substance over flash. When James arrived, he was genuinely pleased to see me, though I could tell he sensed something serious. In my early morning visit, "Bill, this is a nice surprise. How are you doing? I heard the kids were in town for your birthday." "That's actually what I need to talk to you about, James. I'm afraid I have a situation that requires some legal advice." In his office, surrounded by law books and family photos that included pictures of James with his own elderly parents, I laid out the entire situation. The pressure to move, the power of attorney documents, the implied threats about legal competency proceedings. James listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as I continued. "James, I need to know my rights. Can my children force me out of my home? Can they have me declared incompetent simply because I disagree with their plans?" He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered my questions. "Bill, the short answer is that it's much more difficult than they seem to think. Adult children can petition for guardianship of elderly parents, but they'd need to prove actual incompetence through medical evaluations and court proceedings. The fact that you're here asking these questions, that you understand the implications of their requests, and that you're seeking legal counsel all work strongly in your favor. What about the power of attorney documents they want me to sign?" "Absolutely do not sign anything without having it reviewed by independent counsel. Those documents can be written to grant surprisingly broad authority, and once signed, they're very difficult to revoke." He paused, studying my face. "Bill, may I ask what's driving their sudden urgency? This doesn't sound like normal concern for an aging parent." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the mineral rights deed. "I think it might have something to do with this." James read the document carefully, his eyebrows rising as he absorbed its implications. "Bill, do you understand what this represents? Mineral rights in this area could be extremely valuable, especially with the recent geological surveys." "I'm beginning to. James, I need your help with something. I want to understand exactly what these rights mean, what their current value might be, and how I can protect them. I can connect you with a specialist in mineral rights law. But Bill, if your children are aware of this document and its potential value, it explains everything. They're not just trying to move you for your own good. They're positioning themselves to control assets that could be worth considerable money." We spent the next hour discussing my options. James could file documents immediately to establish my legal competence, create safeguards around my property and assets, and ensure that any future legal challenges would face significant obstacles. More importantly, he could help me understand the true value of what I owned and develop a strategy for protecting it. "There's something else, James. I don't want to destroy my relationship with my children if it can be avoided. Is there a way to protect myself while still leaving room for them to do the right thing?" James smiled, and I could see something of his father's wisdom in his expression. "Bill, that's exactly what your wife would have asked. Margaret always believed in giving people opportunities to make better choices before forcing consequences upon them." By 9 o'clock, I had a plan. James would begin immediate legal work to protect my interests, but we'd keep those actions confidential for now. I would return home and give my children one final opportunity to be honest with me about their motivations. Depending on their response, I would either work toward a family solution or implement the legal protections James was preparing. The drive home gave me time to think about confrontation versus collaboration. Margaret had always said that the strongest position was one where you could afford to be generous because you were acting from security rather than fear. If I could establish that security, perhaps my children and I could find a path forward that honored both my autonomy and their concerns. My children were in the kitchen when I returned, apparently having discovered my absence and grown worried. Elena looked relieved when I walked in, though Marcus seemed more annoyed than concerned. "Dad, where were you?" "We were about to call the police," Elena said, rushing to hug me. "I went for a drive. I needed to think clearly about everything we've been discussing." David poured me a cup of coffee, his expression hopeful. "And what did you decide?" I sat down at the kitchen table, the same spot where I'd eaten breakfast every morning for 45 years. "I've decided that before I make any major decisions about my future, I need complete honesty from all of you." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean? We've been completely honest about our concerns for your welfare." "Have you? Let me ask you something specific. Are any of you aware of geological surveys being conducted in this neighborhood? Are you aware of any companies expressing interest in mineral rights or subsurface development?" The silence that followed my questions was more revealing than any words could have been. Elena's face went pale. Marcus closed his laptop. David suddenly found his coffee cup fascinating. Finally, Elena spoke. "Dad, where is this coming from?" "It's coming from the fact that I'm not as naive as you seem to think I am. I've lived in this neighborhood for 45 years. I notice when things change, when companies start approaching residents, when development patterns shift." I paused, giving them a chance to respond honestly. "Now, I'll ask again. Are you aware of any factors that might make this property more valuable than you've let on?" Marcus recovered first, shifting into his professional mode. "Dad, even if there were development interest in the neighborhood, that doesn't change our concerns about your living situation. If anything, it makes it more important for you to be in a safer, more manageable environment. Especially," Elena added, "if property values are increasing. Selling now while the market is strong would give you more resources for your future care." I looked at David, who had always been the most transparent of my children. "David, do you have anything to add?" He met my eyes for a moment, and I saw conflict there, the struggle between his natural honesty and whatever plan he'd agreed to support. "Dad, we just want what's best for you." It wasn't the honesty I'd hoped for, but it told me everything I needed to know. My children were aware of the property's increased value, possibly aware of the mineral rights, and they'd decided to pursue their own interests while presenting it as concern for my welfare. "I see," I said quietly. "In that case, I need to share something with all of you." I pulled out the mineral rights deed and placed it on the table. "Are any of you familiar with this document?" Elena tried to maintain her composure, but I saw recognition flash across her face. Marcus leaned forward to examine the deed, though his expression suggested he'd seen it before. David simply stared at the table. "This deed establishes that I own all mineral rights beneath this property. Based on recent geological surveys, Those rights may be significantly more valuable than any of us previously realized. I looked at each of my children in turn. Now I'll ask one final time. Did your sudden concern for my living situation have anything to do with this document? The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock Margaret had hung above the sink. 30 years ago. My children exchanged glances, apparently trying to decide how much to admit. Marcus spoke first. Dad, we did become aware that there might be some development interest in the neighborhood. Elena heard about it through her real estate contacts. And you decided to move me out of my home to protect me from developers? Elena's professional composure cracked. We decided to help you take advantage of the situation before you missed the opportunity. Real estate markets can change quickly, and at your age, you need to be thinking about maximizing your assets for long-term care. By signing over power of attorney to you and moving to an apartment you'd selected? David finally looked up from the table. Dad, we weren't trying to take advantage of you. We were trying to help you make smart financial decisions. Without consulting me about those decisions, without even telling me about the factors influencing them. Because we knew you'd be stubborn about leaving the house, Marcus said, his patience finally wearing thin. We knew you'd get emotional and refuse to consider the practical benefits. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 70 years, but also feeling stronger than I had in months. My children had revealed their true motivations, and while I was disappointed in their methods, I was no longer confused about the situation. I want all three of you to pack your things and leave my house, I said calmly. Elena looked shocked. Dad, you can't be serious? I'm completely serious. You came here under the pretense of celebrating my birthday, but your real purpose was to manipulate me into giving up my home and my legal autonomy. That's not love. That's exploitation. Marcus stood up, his face flushing with anger. You're being ridiculous. We're your children. We're trying to help you. You're trying to help yourselves. If you were genuinely concerned about my welfare, you would have discussed your concerns openly instead of deceiving me and pressuring me to sign legal documents I hadn't requested. David looked stricken. Dad, please, can't we work this out? Can't we find a compromise? I felt a moment of sympathy for David, who seemed the most conflicted about their approach, but my resolve didn't waver. David, a compromise requires good faith from all parties. Your siblings have demonstrated that they're more interested in controlling my assets than respecting my autonomy. Elena's real estate instincts kicked in as she realized they were losing control of the situation. Dad, you're making a mistake. Without our help, you could lose everything. Developers will take advantage of you. You'll make bad decisions and end up with nothing. That's my risk to take. They're my decisions to make. Marcus gathered his papers and laptop, his movements sharp with frustration. Fine, but don't expect us to bail you out when this all goes wrong. Don't expect us to take care of you when you realize you can't handle everything alone. I've been handling things alone for 18 years, Marcus. I think I'll manage. As my children packed their belongings, I sat in my workshop thinking about the choices people make when they believe others are vulnerable. My children had convinced themselves that deceiving me was justified because they thought they knew better than I did about my own needs and capabilities. They'd forgotten that the man who'd raised them, who'd worked multiple jobs to support their education, who'd managed a household and raised 3 children after their mother died, might have developed some wisdom and strength along the way. Elena was the last to leave, pausing in the doorway as if she wanted to say something that might repair the damage. But whatever words she was considering never came. Instead, she simply said, I hope you know what you're doing, Dad. So do I replied honestly. After their cars pulled out of the driveway, I walked through the house that suddenly felt both empty and completely mine again. The silence was different from the loneliness I'd occasionally felt since Margaret's death. This was the silence of autonomy, of space to think and plan without manipulation or pressure. I called James Hartwell to report on the morning's conversation and to accelerate the legal protections we'd discussed. Then I called Frank and asked if he'd like to join me for coffee at the diner downtown. I had a feeling that other longtime residents might benefit from knowing what was happening in their neighborhood, and Frank had always been good at spreading useful information. The diner was busy with the lunch crowd when Frank and I settled into our usual booth near the window. Over coffee and pie, I told him about the mineral rights discovery and my children's attempted manipulation. Frank listened with the careful attention of someone who'd seen enough of life to understand its complexities. "Sounds like your kids forgot who raised them," Frank said finally. "Sometimes people get so focused on what they think someone needs that they forget to ask what that person wants. The hard part is that I think they convinced themselves they were acting out of love. Maybe they were, partly. But love that doesn't include respect isn't really love. It's just another form of control." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the town continue its daily rhythms outside the window. Finally, Frank spoke again. "So what's your plan now, Bill? You've got valuable property, legal protections in place, and kids who are probably pretty angry with you right now." I thought about Margaret's philosophy of acting from strength rather than fear, of being generous when you could afford to be generous. "I'm going to take control of my own future, Frank. I'm going to understand exactly what I own, what it's worth, and what my options are. And then I'm going to make my own decisions about how to use those assets." "What about the kids?" "They're welcome to be part of my life if they can learn to respect my autonomy. But they're not welcome to control my life just because they think they know better than I do." Frank nodded approvingly. "Margaret would be proud of you, Bill. She always said you were stronger than you realized." Walking home that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The satisfaction of standing up for myself without apology or compromise. My children had attempted to exploit what they saw as my vulnerability, but they'd forgotten that vulnerability and weakness aren't the same thing. Sometimes being vulnerable enough to ask for help when you need it actually demonstrates strength, while refusing to admit your limitations shows weakness. The house welcomed me back with its familiar creaks and shadows. In the workshop, I spread out all the property documents James had helped me understand, along with the mineral rights deed and the recent geological survey information. For the first time in months, I felt like I was looking at my life from a position of knowledge rather than confusion. Margaret's jewelry box sat open on my workbench, and I found myself thinking about the conversation we'd had near the end of her life, about what she wanted me to do after she was gone. She'd made me promise to take care of our children, but she'd also made me promise to take care of myself. "Don't let anyone convince you that being older means being helpless," she'd said. "Don't let anyone, not even our kids, make decisions for you that you're capable of making yourself." At the time, I'd assumed she was talking about some distant future when I might actually need that kind of protection. I'd never imagined that the threat to my autonomy would come from the very children we'd raised to be strong and independent. But Margaret had been wiser than I'd realized. She'd understood that people sometimes mistake age for incompetence, that loving someone doesn't automatically grant you the right to control their choices, and that the greatest gift you can give someone is the confidence to trust their own judgment. As evening approached, I made myself dinner in the kitchen where Margaret and I had shared thousands of meals. The silence was peaceful now rather than lonely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, meetings with mineral rights specialists, conversations with other neighborhood residents, and decisions about how to protect and use assets I was only beginning to. But tonight, I was simply a 70-year-old man in his own home, making his own choices about his own future. And for the first time in months, that felt like exactly where I was supposed to be. The phone rang as I was washing dishes, and I was surprised to hear David's voice when I answered. "Dad?" I wanted to call and apologize. What we did was wrong, and I'm sorry I went along with it. I dried my hands and sat down at the kitchen table, I appreciate that, David. What made you change your mind? Honestly, talking to my wife about everything when I got home. She asked me how I'd feel if our kids tried to manipulate me into giving up my home when I was 70. She asked me whether we'd actually been thinking about your welfare or our own convenience. And what? Did you conclude? That we'd convinced ourselves we were helping you, but we were really just trying to solve our own anxiety about your living situation by controlling your choices. I felt a spark of hope. Of all my children, David had always been the most capable of genuine self-reflection. David, I'm glad you called. I love you, and I want you to be part of my life. But I need you to understand that I'm not ready to be managed by my children. I'm still capable of making my own decisions, even if they're not the decisions you'd make for me. I understand that now, Dad, and I want to try to do better. Then we'll work on rebuilding our relationship. But it will have to be based on mutual respect, not on your assumption that I need you to take care of me. Fair enough. Dad, I love you too. After we hung up, I felt cautiously optimistic that at least one of my children might be capable of growth. Whether Marcus and Elena would come to similar realizations remained to be seen, but David's call reminded me that people can change when they're willing to examine their own motivations honestly. The evening news included a story about mineral rights discoveries in several metropolitan areas, and I realized that my situation was part of a larger pattern affecting older homeowners across the country. Knowledge truly was power, and I was just beginning to understand how much power I actually possessed. 3 weeks after my children left, I stood in the conference room of Peterson and Associates mineral rights specialists, looking at charts and geological maps that transformed my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my modest neighborhood. Dr. Sarah Peterson, a geologist with 30 years of experience in subsurface analysis, had spent 2 hours explaining why my property and several others in the area had become the focus of intense corporate interest. Mr. Morrison, what we're looking at here is a significant natural gas formation that extends beneath approximately 40 properties in your neighborhood, Dr. Peterson said, pointing to colored sections on a detailed map. Your property sits directly over one of the richest concentrations we've identified. The numbers she'd presented were staggering. Conservative estimates suggested my mineral rights could be worth between $800,000 and $1.2 million, depending on extraction agreements and market conditions. More optimistic projections, based on similar formations in other states, ranged as high as $2 million. The development company that approached you represents a consortium of energy firms, she continued. They've been systematically trying to acquire both surface properties and mineral rights throughout this area. Your decision not to sell was financially sound, even if you didn't realize it at the time. James Hartwell sat beside me, taking notes and asking the detailed legal questions I wouldn't have thought to pose. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd become more than just my attorney. He'd become my advocate in navigating a complex situation. That required expertise I didn't possess. What are Mr. Morrison's options at this point? James asked. Dr. Peterson pulled out another set of documents. Several. He can lease the mineral rights while retaining ownership, which would provide immediate income plus royalties from any gas extracted. He can sell the rights outright for a lump sum, or he can partner with other local property owners to negotiate collectively for better terms. The collective negotiation option intrigued me. How would that work? There are 8 other property owners in your immediate area who hold their own mineral rights. If you negotiate as a group, you have much more leverage than any individual owner. The development consortium needs access to multiple properties to make extraction economically viable. I thought about Frank and Mrs. Chen, about the other, longtime residents who'd built their lives in this neighborhood without knowing they were sitting on hidden wealth. Have the other property owners been contacted about this? Some have, but the development company has been deliberately vague about the true value of what they're offering. They're hoping to acquire rights cheaply before owners understand what they're really worth. James leaned forward. Dr. Peterson, what would you recommend as the best approach for protecting Mr. Morrison's interests while also helping his neighbors? I'd recommend he take the lead in organizing a neighborhood association of mineral rights holders. Education. First, make sure everyone understands what they own and what it's worth. Then, collective negotiation to ensure fair terms for everyone. Driving home from that meeting, I felt the same sense of purpose I'd experienced decades earlier when I'd first become a father. I had knowledge that could benefit not just myself, but an entire community of people who'd invested their lives in this neighborhood. Mrs. Chen, who'd lived next door for 30 years. Frank, who'd raised his family here. The Washingtons, who'd bought their house after retiring from teaching careers. The Hendersons, whose grandchildren played in the yard where their own children had grown up. These were people who'd built their lives around community and continuity, and they deserved to understand and benefit from the wealth that lay beneath their feet. That evening, I called Frank and explained what I'd learned. His response was characteristically direct. So you're saying I might be sitting on enough money to leave my grandkids a real inheritance instead of just this old house? That's exactly what I'm saying, Frank, but only if we're smart about how we handle this. What do you need from me? Help organizing a meeting with the other longtime residents. We need to share this information and decide how to proceed together. Within a week, my living room was filled with neighbors I'd known for decades, but had never gathered in one place. Mrs. Chen sat in Margaret's favorite armchair, her sharp eyes taking in every detail as Dr. Peterson explained the geological findings. Frank occupied the couch with Tom and Betty Henderson, who'd lived 3 houses down since 1985. The Washingtons had brought their son Michael, who worked as an engineer and asked thoughtful technical questions. Dr. Peterson was patient and thorough, explaining complex geological concepts in terms everyone could understand. She showed maps, shared comparable data from other regions, and answered every question with the kind of expertise that built confidence rather than confusion. The most important thing to understand, she concluded, is that you have time to make informed decisions. The gas isn't going anywhere, and the development companies need your cooperation more than you need their immediate offers. Mrs. Chen, who'd remained silent through most of the presentation, finally spoke. Dr. Peterson, in your professional opinion, are we better served by working together or negotiating individually? Definitely together. The development consortium is counting on individual property owners accepting their initial offers without understanding the full value. When property owners organize and negotiate collectively, the terms improve dramatically. After Dr. Peterson left, we spent another hour discussing our options. The conversation revealed the diverse needs and priorities of our group. Mrs. Chen wanted to ensure her daughter would inherit something of real value. Frank hoped to help his grandchildren with college expenses. The Washingtons were interested in funding their church's community programs. The Hendersons wanted to establish trust funds for their grandchildren's education. It sounds like we all want similar things, I said. Financial security for our families and the ability to support causes we care about. The question is whether we trust each other enough to work together. Frank nodded. I've known most of you for 30 years or more. If I can't trust this group, I can't trust anyone. By the end of the evening, we'd agreed to form the Riverside Neighborhood Mineral Rights Association, with me serving as the initial coordinator. Our first priority would be education, ensuring that every property owner understood their rights and options. Our second priority would be developing a negotiation strategy that maximized value for all participants while respecting individual preferences. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into learning everything I could about mineral rights law, extraction techniques, and negotiation strategies. I read industry publications, attended webinars, and consulted with experts in multiple fields, It was the most intellectually challenging work I'd done since my engineering days, and I discovered that my 70-year-old mind was still perfectly capable of mastering complex new information. More importantly, I discovered that I had a talent for translating technical information into practical terms that helped my neighbors understand their options. Mrs. Chen, who'd run her late husband's accounting practice for 40 years, became our financial analyst. Frank, with his machinist's precision, took charge of documenting property boundaries and ownership details. The Washingtons handled communication, with other neighborhood associations facing similar situations. 1 month after our first meeting, we received our first formal offer from the development consortium. It was substantially higher than their initial individual approaches, but Dr. Peterson's analysis suggested it was still significantly below market value. "They're testing us," she explained during our review meeting. "They want to see if organizing as a group was just a negotiating tactic or if you're serious about understanding true market value." Mrs. Chen studied the offer with the same intensity she'd once brought to complex tax returns. "The terms look reasonable on the surface, but the royalty percentages are low compared to what you've shown us from other regions." "Exactly," Dr. Peterson confirmed. "In similar formations, royalty rates typically range from 15 to 25%. They're offering 12%. Frank leaned back in his chair. "So, what's our counteroffer?" I'd been thinking about this question for weeks, not just in terms of financial maximization, but in terms of community impact and long-term relationships. "I think we counter with terms that reflect true market value, but we also propose something they might not expect." "What do you mean?" Betty Henderson asked. "We propose a community benefit component, a percentage of revenues dedicated to neighborhood improvements, local scholarships, or community programs. We turn this from a purely extractive relationship into a partnership that benefits the entire area." The room fell silent as people considered this suggestion. Finally, Mrs. Chen smiled. "That's exactly what this neighborhood needs. We've always taken care of each other. Why should that change? Just because we've discovered we're sitting on valuable resources?" Our counterproposal was comprehensive and creative. We asked for fair market royalty rates, reasonable lease terms, and environmental protections. But we also proposed the creation of a community development fund that would receive 5% of all royalty payments to be used for neighborhood improvements, educational programs, and support for longtime residents who might face property tax increases due to development activity. The Development Consortium's response took 3 weeks, and it was more positive than any of us had expected. They accepted our royalty rate requests, agreed to most of our environmental protections, and expressed interest in the community fund concept, though they wanted to negotiate the specific percentage and oversight structure. "They're taking you seriously," Dr. Peterson reported during our next meeting. "That proposal tells me they see this as a long-term partnership rather than a simple resource extraction." As negotiations continued, something unexpected began happening in our neighborhood. Word of our organizing efforts spread to other areas facing similar development pressure, and I started receiving calls from community leaders asking for advice and assistance. What had begun as an effort to protect my own interests had evolved into something much larger. Mrs. Chen suggested we formalize our community education efforts by creating workshops for other neighborhood groups. "We've learned so much about mineral rights and community organizing," she said. "That knowledge could help a lot of people avoid being taken advantage of." The first workshop we hosted drew representatives from 6 different neighborhoods. I found myself standing in front of 30 people, sharing the lessons we'd learned about research, organization, and negotiation. It was the most energizing work I'd done in years, combining my technical background with the community leadership skills I'd developed over decades of neighborhood involvement. "The most important thing to remember," I told the group, "is that knowledge is power, but organized knowledge is transformation. Individual property owners have limited leverage, but communities working together can shape the terms of their Own development. After the workshop, a woman named Patricia Rodriguez approached me. She was about my daughter Elena's age, a former social worker who'd moved to the area after retirement. "Mr. Morrison, what you've accomplished here is remarkable. Have you considered that these skills could help communities beyond just mineral rights issues? There are neighborhoods facing all kinds of development pressure, property tax displacement, and corporate manipulation." Her words sparked an idea that had been forming in the back of my mind. What if the Riverside Neighborhood Association became a model for community empowerment in other contexts? What if the organizing and negotiation skills we'd developed could help other groups of people who felt powerless in the face of larger economic forces? That evening, I called David to share what had been happening. Our relationship had been slowly rebuilding through weekly phone calls, and he'd been genuinely supportive of my community organizing efforts. "Dad, you sound more energetic than you have in years," he said after I'd described the latest developments. "I feel more energetic than I have in years. I'd forgotten how good it feels to work towards something meaningful, to use your skills to help people who need help." "What about Marcus and Elena? Have you heard from them?" I hesitated before answering. Elena sent a text last week saying she'd heard about the mineral rights discovery and hoped I was making sound financial decisions. Marcus hasn't contacted me at all. "They're probably embarrassed about how they handled everything," David said quietly. "I know I still feel terrible about trying to manipulate you. David, the difference is that you've acknowledged what happened and worked to repair our relationship. That takes courage and maturity. I learned that from you, Dad. You and Mom always taught us that mistakes aren't failures unless you refuse to learn from them." 2 weeks later, the Development Consortium agreed to our final terms. The contract we signed guaranteed fair royalty rates, strong environmental protections, and the establishment of the Riverside Community Development Fund. Conservative projections suggested that each participating property owner would receive between $40,000 and $60,000 annually in royalty payments, with the potential for significantly higher returns if gas prices increased or extraction expanded. More importantly, the Community Development Fund would generate approximately $30,000 annually for neighborhood improvements and programs. We'd successfully transformed a potential exploitation situation into a genuine partnership that benefited the entire community. The celebration we held at Frank's house that evening was unlike anything our neighborhood had ever experienced. Property owners who'd been strangers despite living near each other for decades had become genuine collaborators and friends. We'd not only protected our individual interests, but had strengthened our entire community in the process. Mrs. Chen raised her glass of wine during the informal toasts. To Bill Morrison, who taught us that getting older doesn't mean getting helpless, and that organizing beats worrying every time. Frank added his own toast. To second acts and new beginnings, and to the kind of leadership that brings out the best in everyone around it. As I looked around Frank's living room at these remarkable people who'd become true partners in community building, I thought about the conversation that had started this entire journey. My children had tried to convince me that I was too old, too vulnerable, and too set in my ways to handle my own affairs effectively. They'd believed that love meant protecting me from my own choices rather than supporting me in making informed decisions. But the past 3 months had proven exactly the opposite. At 70, I'd learned complex new skills, built meaningful relationships, and created value not just for myself, but for an entire community. I'd discovered that experience combined with purpose creates a powerful force for positive change, and that wisdom earned through decades of living can be one of life's most valuable assets. The next morning, I sat in my workshop surrounded by maps, contracts, and correspondence from communities asking for assistance with their own development challenges. Margaret's jewelry box was open on my workbench, and I found myself thinking about the promise I'd made to her about taking care of our children. I was still committed to that promise, but I now understood that taking care of them didn't mean enabling them to avoid the consequences of their choices. It meant modeling the kind of integrity, wisdom, and community leadership I hoped they'd eventually embrace in their own lives. Elena had built a successful real estate development business, but she'd forgotten that true development means building communities, not just extracting value from them. Marcus had mastered the technical aspects of financial management, but he'd lost sight of the fact that money is a tool for creating security and opportunity, not a weapon for controlling other people. David was learning these lessons through our rebuilt relationship, but his siblings would have to find their own paths toward understanding. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, I heard a familiar voice. "Dad? It's Elena. I was wondering if we could talk." I set down the mineral rights correspondence and gave my daughter my full attention. "Of course, Elena. What would you like to talk about?" "I heard about what you've accomplished with the neighborhood association and the mineral rights negotiations. I wanted to congratulate you and to apologize for underestimating you so badly." "I appreciate that, Elena. What made you change your perspective?" "Honestly, professional curiosity. When I heard about the terms you'd negotiated, I couldn't believe a group of individual property owners had achieved that level of success. So I researched what you'd done, and I realized that you'd accomplished something I've been trying to do in my own business for years: create development partnerships that actually benefit existing communities instead of displacing them." "And what did you conclude?" "That I'd been so focused on what I thought you needed that I completely missed what you were actually capable of. I treated you like a problem to be solved instead of a person with valuable skills and experience." Felt a familiar warmth, the same feeling I'd experienced when Elena had first learned to ride a bicycle or mastered a difficult piece on the piano. My daughter was capable of growth and self-reflection, just as David had been. "Elena, I'd like to rebuild our relationship too, but it will have to be based on mutual respect. I'm not the helpless old man you thought I was, and I won't accept being treated as one." "I understand that now, Dad. And I was wondering if you might be willing to share some of what you've learned about community organizing and development partnerships. I think there might be ways we could work together that would benefit both of our communities." For the first time in months, I felt genuinely hopeful about the possibility of reconciling with my children while maintaining the autonomy and dignity I'd fought so hard to preserve. Elena was offering to learn from me rather than manage me, to collaborate rather than control. "I'd be very interested in exploring that possibility," I said. "Why don't you come for dinner this weekend? We can talk about what you've been working on and what I've been learning." After we hung up, I walked through the house that had been the center of so much conflict and transformation. The rooms felt different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because my relationship to this space had evolved. This wasn't just the house where I'd raised my family or the property I'd defended against manipulation. It was the headquarters of a community organization that was helping people across the region protect their interests and build stronger neighborhoods. Margaret's presence seemed especially strong in the kitchen, where I'd shared so many conversations about the children we were raising and the values we hoped to instill in them. I could almost hear her voice reminding me that the best gifts parents can give their children aren't financial inheritance or protective intervention, but the confidence to face challenges with integrity and the wisdom to treat others with dignity and respect. As I prepared for another day of community organizing and mineral rights consultation, I realized that my children's attempt to control my life had inadvertently given me the greatest gift of my later years: the opportunity to discover that aging doesn't mean diminishing, that wisdom is a renewable resource, and that the most meaningful work often begins just when others assume your productive life is ending. The forgotten thing my children had overlooked wasn't just the mineral rights deed hidden in my workshop. It was the strength, intelligence, and leadership capacity of the man who'd raised them, and who was still capable of growth, learning, and positive impact at 70 years old. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight, I was simply grateful to be exactly where I belonged, in my own home, making my own choices, and using my experience to help others do the same. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.